Okay. In 1492, when the Sephardic Jews were expelled from Spain, there were very few possessions that they were allowed to take with them. But what they could take with them that could not be taken from them was their belief in their religion, experiences and skills, and their customs, their traditions, and their language, Judeo-Espanol, or as we commonly call it, Ladino, the language of the Sephardim. And they also took with them their songs, the romanceros they sang. Now, most of the Jews that left Spain traveled to the next door neighbor of Portugal, but they did not remain there that long because in 1497, as I explained in the video, they were to leave again. However, many of them did not leave because they were forcibly converted to Catholicism. And so throughout the 1500s, they began leaving Portugal. They would follow the same routes as those who had left Spain. They would go to North Africa, they would go to the New World, they would go to the lowland, to the Low Countries of Holland and Belgium, they would go up into England, to Germany, to Italy, but the vast majority of them went to the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire at that time extended as far north as what we know of as Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Austria, not Austria, but Hungary, and down into Greece, Turkey, Syria, and Israel and Egypt. Now, large centers were set up of Sephardim in these areas. They were in Constantinople, Istanbul, in Salonika, and in Sfat in Israel. Now, at its height, Constantinople or Istanbul had about 50,000 Sephardim. Salonika had about 70,000. In comparison, the Jews on the island of Rhodes, numbering maybe 5,000 at most, was quite small. But it was important because that's where my family came from. The Jews from Rhodes are called Rudisli. Now, Rhodes in 1522 was taken from the Knights of St. John by the Ottomans. And the Ottoman Empire had said, or the Sultan had said to the Jews, come settle on our land and live here openly as Jews. Now, I often wonder what would have happened if there had been a Sultan at the time that the Jews were being persecuted by the Nazis. Now, the Jews lived on Rhodes from 1512 until 1944. In 1912, it became a protectorate of the Italian government. And so the Jews lived there under the Italians. And in 1936, when Mussolini, as part of the Axis powers, came in, there were new racial laws that were instituted on Rhodes, which meant that their rabbinical college, for which they were famous, was closed. Jews were forced to work on Saturdays, and all Jews who did not belong to Rhodes, in other words, who were not born there, had to leave. Now, in 1944, Nazis arrived on Rhodes, and the 1,700 people who were living on Rhodes were put onto 3 boats, taken to Piraeus, then put on cattle cars, and sent off to the death camps of Auschwitz and Dachau. My grandparents were among them. My grandmother was 50 years old when she was murdered in the death camps, a year older than I am. I have 2 aunts that survived. Now, I grew up in Los Angeles in what was a Jewish ghetto or Juderia. And I grew up among my relatives and my extended family, speaking Ladino, hearing this music, living in this culture, and believing that all other people lived as we did. It wasn't until I went to school at some point, realized that my family was not in the mainstream of American life. My family and the relatives I grew up with spoke longingly of Rhodes and the culture they left behind. It was a very rich culture. And it is a culture that I would like to help preserve. And it is because I am interested in my culture and want to help preserve it that led me to make these two videos. The first one, or the one you see today, is about how the Jews came to be in Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula. And the second one that I made is about specifically the customs and the language. Briefly, let me just say we speak Spanish. It is the Spanish that was spoken at the time of Cortez, the time of Isabella and Ferdinand, of Cervantes. It is Spanish that was written in Hebrew characters at that time. It is only in the latter part of the 20th century, or the early part of the 20th century, that it was phonetically written in Latin characters. And so if you know Spanish, for instance, we say the Spanish word for boy is hijo. Well, we pronounce that J, je, so it comes out iju. We from Rhodes pronounce that O, u, so it's not ijo, but iju. And as we moved into the Ottoman Empire, we took into our language also words that we did not have when we lived in Spain. So for instance, we're going to say the word for fork, which is tenedor. We don't say tenedor because they didn't have forks in 1492. We say peron, which is French, because we were educated in French schools. And we also took in words that were Greek and words that were Turkish and Hebrew words. And so our language is a very rich language. In the video you're going to be seeing, I'm wearing a Turkish wedding dress. It is a dress, the material of which was very commonly seen in homes of some. They would place it on their walls. It was placed in the synagogues on the, not an altar, but where the bima is, a speaker stand where they placed their Bible. And this kind of material with this embroidery was placed there. It's velvet and 18-karat gold embroidery. I would like to say to you, I hope that you are interested in this culture, and if you are, that on May 17th, we will be having a commemoration to honor the expulsion of the Jews, Sephardim. It will be at the Friedman Center on Sunday, May 17th, and we will have singing in Ladino. There will be a singer. There will be dancing. There will be food. There will be exhibit of artifacts and photographs. There will be a slideshow. And I will be presenting the second video on Rhodes. Thank you very much.
Are you on the right channel? Technology.
Outdated.
Yeah, it's short. As it gets on.
Get all three. Get all three. How about just try 6? That's 16.
That doesn't look like it. Russ is up there now.
There's a man living in Oakmont.
We met him. 106 years old. Are any of you missing one of these people who didn't get? You can run off of it.
I can control the volume with this.
Well, we don't have any sound. There should be sound on now.
Missing the music.
You can't control my sound, Bob, I'm sorry.
Have them rewind it.
Did you turn it down on this one?
Yes.
Yes, on both of them, so
And then you turn them back up both?
No.
that's what he's doing now.
Don't even have this down, he can't turn it on. You got it.
You have to.
Yeah, I'll let these on TV.
Make it a rewind it so that they can start from the beginning again.
They just playing weird here. You keep missing.
I am not a scholar, nor do I have all the answers, but my personal struggle was to make sense what happened to the Sephardim. I'd like to share with you what I learned. Let's begin with how the Jews came to be in Spain and Portugal. With the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians in 586 BC, 50 years later, Babylonian Jews returned to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. Again, the Jews were taken into exile, this time into the Roman Empire, and dispersed. The Jews who settled in the area of the Iberian Peninsula, later to be called Spain and Portugal, were called Sephardim, Sepharad into Spain. The Jews who settled in the area of the Rhineland, later to be called Germany, Austria, Hungary, Poland, were called Ashkenazim. Ashkenazi in Hebrew refers to Germany. The regions the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews settled were totally diverse and were to greatly influence our thinking, our language, our music, our food, our way of life. But belief in the same religion, the same God, and the same prayers. In 711 AD, the Moors began moving from North Africa into the southern portion of the Iberian Peninsula.
bringing with them their religion of Islam. They invited the Jews who were living there under the Christian Visigoths to help them settle the colonies. Because the Jews knew the land, the people, and the language of the people. Council that levied taxes and had jurisdiction over every aspect of Jewish life and law. Philosopher and religious scholar Maimonides. Those Jews who excelled became influential at court as physicians, viceroys, and financial advisors. We were tax collectors, scientists, also prominent in the silk and textile industry, international trade and finance. But the majority worked as farmers, artisans, merchants, weavers, tailors, and goldsmiths. Combing her hair. He recognizes her, but she doesn't know him. But the sun began to set for the Moors, as one village after another fell to the reconquest of Spain by the Christians. By 1250, only the kingdom of Granada remained in Moorish hands, where Jews and Moors continued to live together until 1492. Jews played an important diplomatic role in them, invited Jews to colonize towns. We were offered homes, lands, vineyards, tax exemptions as inducements to settle. In the beginning, we were valuable because we spoke Arabic, had expertise in government, finance, and trade. But most importantly, we continued to pay the poll tax. Toledo remained an important Jewish center, with the populationity as a mere formality. But for the majority of Jews, it was an act of extreme distaste, and they were to remain secret Jews, practicing their religion behind closed doors. They were to remain living in the Juderia and in their same homes. The Christians who had no love for the Jews had even less for the conversos, who they saw as insincere in their new religion. As they witnessed conversos moving into positions of power, called the auto de fa, a public ceremony. Jews who were unable to prove their sincerity were to be burned at the stake. The records state that by 1525, 28,650 men and women were burned at the stake. 16,420 were also burned in effigy. All their property and possessions confiscated. He is first told that he must rid his kingdom of his Jews. Now, he does not wish to lose their revenue because they are paying poll taxes. And so he tries to convince them to convert. When that fails, he uses coercion. Young Jewish men are seized and sent to Portuguese colonies in Africa. There are mass forced, and I underline the word forced, conversions. One account listed 20,000. And finally, in 1497, all Jew converso family in the 1500s in Portugal. When her husband died, she took her family on holiday to Holland. And when it was discovered that she was a Marano, she fled to the Ottoman Empire. She spent the rest of her life using her wealth and her time, with the help of her son-in-law, bringing Sephardim and Moranos out of Spain and Portugal and settling them in the Ottoman Empire. For the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the Sephardim, the right to live there openly as Jews. I am reminded of the lines from the poet Yehuda Halevi, and he toiled and he grieved and he broke down into tears when he left Sefarad. Nochada buena.
I saw you last year with the geography lecture series.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Your name is,
Tony White.
that's right. That's just-
We have a few more of these. Anybody that didn't get one?
I wonder what's the format here? I'm not sure. Sorry,
I
you know.
really don't know what the format is. Maybe I could ask them if they had any questions. Hi.
Hello.
You're from
Turkey.
Turkey. Oh, nice to meet you. ¿Hablas español?
No, unfortunately, my generation doesn't speak that English. You know, I'll be going to mention that too, but I'm going to learn very soon. I teach my children.
Beautiful language.
Excuse me, Esther.
Hello.
I'm Steve Walkers. Would you like to say anything more right now, or should we open it up to the other members of the panel?
Open it up unless they
I think
have any
she has
questions.
on the phone. but
Yeah.
that-
Before the panel begins, I just wanted to ask you if you had any questions specifically about the video. Yes?
How did the synagogue in Spain, I guess, become named Santa Maria?
Yeah. The question is, how is it that the synagogue in Toledo is called Synagogue Santa Maria la Blanca? Well, the synagogues were taken over by the Christians, and not only was it called Santa Maria de la Blanca, but before that it was a stable. It was used to house soldiers. It was used as a storeroom. It was desecrated many times. So it was not uncommon for synagogues to be taken and used for whatever purposes and then used as churches. So that's why it is named that.
What was the original synagogue name, do you know?
That's the name that they have today. No, I don't know.
Why don't the panel go ahead?
Oh, okay, I'm guess by default the moderator here. I just
Use the microphone.
want to say we have Professor Tony White from history, and I'm Steve Waters from history, and Alper Al-Malek, who's a student at Sonoma State from Turkey, a Sephardic Jew. And we have a kind of order here. Professor White will say a few words, and then I'll follow, and Alper will be the cleanup hitter of the four of us today, and then after that
Will be a lecture series on 1492, sponsored by the History Department. Basically, like this, a class available for credit, but also a public lecture series on all different aspects, perspectives, hopefully, of what happened before and around the year 1492, and obviously the long-term consequences. So I welcome all of you to participate in that and all the other activities that will be happening this year. I should also point out that in no way is that lecture series planned as a celebration. It's basically taking advantage of the 500th anniversary to look at it from many different perspectives and see how the world was changed or affected as a result of the expansion of Europe. First of all, my field is Latin American history, but I also have taught, not recently, history of Spain and Spain and Portugal. And I therefore am not really an expert on Spain or Portugal to any degree, and certainly on the Jewish experience in Spain or Portugal. In terms of the film, I think, as far as I'm concerned, it covers an awful lot of history in sort of a capsule form. I also think, however, that anything like this, it's very difficult to treat something like this in 20, 25 minutes and really do justice to the topic, or on the other hand, put it in the proper historical context. And so what I'm going to try to do is, in some cases, repeat some of the information in the videotape, but just go over briefly some of the history of Spain and Portugal, which I guess would provide some of the context, but also help to explain why things 1992. Not as an apology in any way, but just as historical information or background. And I think if we're really to learn any lessons from history, we need to have as accurate a version and as many different perspectives as possible if we're really going to, if those lessons are going to be valid and hold up. The film does go into the extensive sort of, you might say, Jewish experience or background in the Iberian Peninsula. And that goes back to the 1st century AD to accept conversion or expulsion. That was followed in 693 by the banning of Jews from markets or trading with Christians. And then we have a series of developments. I mean, this is obviously just hitting a few highlights, you might say, in terms of religious tolerance or lack of it in the Iberian Peninsula. In 711, the Visigothic period came to an end with the invasion of North Africans. This is another important thing I think that we should deal with when we deal with terminology, etc., because they knew there was home for them in the House of Islam, and that they would, be at least have more status or freedom there than they would perhaps under the Christian kingdoms. We then have this period from 711, and by the way, that was later on used against the Jews in Spain because rather than being seen as more or less opportunists and taking advantage of this North African invasion, they actually were labeled as traitors and not basically as just opportunists at the time. We then have this to 1492, which is known as the Reconquista and very much celebrated in Spain, particularly this year along with the discovery of America, etc., because it is concluded with the successful invasion and seizure of the Kingdom of Granada. This was the last Muslim kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula, and that was completed in 1492. Now, unfortunately, the last part of that, let's say, Reconquista, has been or was interpreted as a continuous religion against non-believers or infidels. Well, it was anything but that. We had Christians fighting Christians, and Christians and Muslims fighting other Christians, et cetera, all kinds of very different kind of alliances going on through this 800-year period. And it was not just one continuous religious crusade. But it's a good example of how, what is really important sometimes is not necessarily what happened in history, but what people think happened and how they perceived it. And so, because it was interpreted as a religious crusade near the end, particularly by Ferdinand and Isabella, they could continue that crusade within Spain itself, or Christian Spain. Going back a little bit to this period, from 711 to 1492, we do have, even though I think the image of both Christian and even Muslim Spain or Islam today is of a very sort of intolerant people or faith, etc. But there were long periods of tolerance within the Christian kingdoms of Muslims and Jews, or in the territory they conquered. Not that Christians and Jews had equal status with Christians, but they were allowed to practice their religion, etc. They also served as tax collectors or agents for the landed nobility in collecting rents, etc. They have very important positions in the church, including positions in the Inquisition or as bishops in the Catholic Church. So I think it's important to realize that there's this long sort of tradition here, and it wasn't one long religious crusade or long period of religious intolerance. In the Muslim kingdom, Muslims were better off than Christians or Jews. In the Christian kingdoms, obviously, the Christian kingdoms were better off in tax-wise or opportunity-wise. The film mentions in 1391 the priest Martinez who stirs up the mob in Seville, and eventually we have a mass of persecution or massacres throughout Spain, with probably 50,000 Jews being slaughtered by mobs. This is in 1391. That period then leads to, you might say, a forced conversion of Jews that stay in Spain or Portugal, become conversos and accepting Christianity, but in many cases obviously retain practicing their religion. So the incident of 1391, I think, it's important, another example of, so you might say, popular anti-Semitism being stirred up by a member of the clergy, and then that leading to the forced conversion of other Jews, up to as many as 200,000 throughout what is now Spain. The next major period is the unification of the two kingdoms of Aragon and Castile by the marriage of Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Aragon, and Queen Isabella, eventually the heir or successor to the throne of Castile. These are the two most. Now, that unification is more or less a name only, because actually Isabella has no authority in Aragon and Ferdinand has no authority within Castile. And in fact, the first institution which they apply for to Rome in 1478, the Spanish Inquisition, is basically the first national institution within what becomes Spain, that it had jurisdiction not only over Castile, but Castile and Aragon, where none of the other political institutions basically had that kind of. Isn't really, well, it is dealt with in the film, and I know your last presentation, we discussed it afterwards. It's important to remember that the Inquisition basically did not affect, or it did affect certainly, but the target was not, practitioners of Judaism or Jews. It was mainly new Christians, conversos who had converted to Christianity, and then later on, Muslims who became what are called Moriscos, or you might say new Christians, but from Islam, Morisco or Marano, as they were called, converso. you therefore had accepted Christianity, but if there was any indication in terms of washing your hand or the way you conducted your life in any way, you might be suspect and therefore come under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. For instance, unbaptized Indians in the New World had, the Inquisition had no authority over them because they were not Christian. Once they accepted Christianity or something like that, they then could be subject to the tribunals.
That clarifies it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And, well, Christian children and some kind of religious sacrifice or ceremony. So those things certainly continued throughout this period. And therefore, somebody who was a converso or new Christian, and particularly if they held a prominent position in the government or was a tax collector, could in some way be, say, pointed out by an enemy or rival to the Inquisition, and they would then come under some kind of suspicion, trial, seizure, torture, etc. It was not, however, again, I don't think, when we look at it, there is certainly an anti-Semitism. But we're also dealing with a period in time, I think that the Inquisition itself and eventually the expulsion was as much social and political and economic as it was, say, religious. And at that time, you cannot really separate religion from politics or government, at least in most of Europe, I think, and probably most of the world at that time. There's another thing that develops along with this, and it's still something which is a very important factor, I think, in Spanish culture even today, is what is called the limpieza de sangre. And so, eventually, what are called blood laws are passed. That means that a person who has any kind of Jewish ancestry back to, say, 4 generations cannot hold a position in the government or in the Catholic Church. But that eventually develops, you might say, what's called limpieza de sangre, purity or cleansing of the blood. That it's almost, you can't prove that you're a Spaniard racially, but you can by showing that you're an old, and anybody who is more, in other words, being a Spaniard is tantamount to being a pure old Christian, and this was important not only for the nobility to attack in some ways the conversos or their rivals, but also for even the peasantry or the lower classes could say, well, I'm not a person of the higher ranks, but I'm equal to or I'm better than the new Christians because I'm a pure Christian. And of course, when it came around to trials or accusations, usually the people who had higher status, education, something like that, was much easier for records to prove that they were new Christians or former Jews or had Jewish ancestors, etc., than it was for a member of the lower ranks, for which there were probably not all these records, etc. I know I'm getting off here a little bit. Let me try to wrap it up here in just a minute. Following the Inquisition, I mean, we do have the horrible things that the Spanish Inquisition engaged in, and that is the seizures, the secrecy, the torture, the executions, etc. I don't in any way want to be seen as an apologist that their history or culture has been very much distorted by Northern England and Protestant Europe, etc. And that the Inquisition, to some degree, is part of the leyenda negra, or the black legend of Spanish culture and stuff. And so that, I remember growing up back east and seeing a film script in elementary school that dealt somehow with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And basically was celebrated as the defeat of that horrible despot, Philip II of Spain. Well, basically, propaganda for the British Navy and the sort of English tradition and culture. Groups together very often was religion. And the way eventually seen by the Catholic kings, that is Ferdinand and Isabella, for uniting Spain, was uniting it through one faith. And that once they had defeated the Muslims in Granada, which was interpreted as a crusade against the faith, the logical consequence, or you might say, or conclusion of that was, and also the Inquisition, was to expel the Jews and later the Muslims from Iberia or from Spain. I think that's really important to realize, that the decision there, and you might say Spain lost not only a significant number, but a very prominent, well-educated, qualified, you might say, part of its population. And some people, interpret the decline or the beginning of the decline of Spain as a great power dates from 1492 and the expulsion of the Jewish population. I think that, to some degree, oversimplifies it. There are so many factors that came into the decline of Spain from being the dominant power in Spain or in the New World. The expulsion of the Jews and later the Moriscos, or Muslims, played a role. But there are many other factors I think that are equally important. By the way, in 1502, we do have the expulsion of the Muslims. The majority of them actually chose to convert, became Moriscos or new Christians. Some left. Eventually, when you do have the crackdown on the New Christians and Moriscos later on, beginning of the 1600s or the 17th century, there's a very large departure. And actually, when in 1609 the Moriscos actually are expelled from southern Spain, it's as many as 275,000 who mainly go to North Africa, which is at that time about 5% of the population. And in some areas like Valencia, which was a very important agricultural area, it was like 50 or 40% of the population of that area. And it left areas that were, so you might say, agricultural cornucopias or something like that, all of a sudden became barren deserts, and even today are not producing the way they were before, say, 1609. Let me wrap up here. The other thing, when you were dealing with the Inquisition, and there's various ways of looking at this, but I think it's important and probably useful in discussing, is that in spite of the Inquisition and the effect that it had on obviously selected groups within the population, but let's say on the overall intellectual climate of Spain from that period until the 19th century, yet at the time when the Inquisition was at its strength, we have the golden age of Spanish art, literature, throughout the 16th and into the 17th century, up to about 1650. And that was when the Inquisition was probably at its most powerful and most effective, yet we have a renaissance in all different areas intellectually. Now, the argument might be, well, it could have been even greater if there hadn't been this repression going on, or if it had been more varied or more open, you might say. In the long run, I think probably a major factor, and probably the most important impact on later Spanish history or culture, was the physical expulsion of certain groups of people, but the general psyche or national psyche or attitude that is created. Spain, as a result of the completion of the Reconquista, in some ways became a crusading nation. It carried its crusade to the New World, Africa, and even Asia. And also isolated itself. Eventually the Inquisition isolated Spain, so it was no longer involved in the currents of thought throughout the rest of Europe. And it also, I think, inhibited discourse or open discussion. And as recently as, 19 was still alive, and he died in 1975, Protestants could not openly worship within Spain. So that kind of thing, now it's open today. I was in Spain last summer, and it's in some ways a frighteningly open society today, even more so than this country or I think other countries in Europe. It's gone from an extreme sort of, I don't know, very conservative, terroristic kind of climate to a very open and very creative society, I think. Well, let me stop there.
Thank you, Tony. Health was issued from Alhambra, the capital of the newly conquered Muslim state of Granada, which gives a certain kind of victory aspect to the decree expelling Jews, or at least giving them 4 months to make up their mind. And as we may accept or may believe that there's a certain connection between obviously the conquest of Granada and the need to suddenly expel, and in a sense knew how to unify and control, rule his state properly in Machiavelli's point of view. So in a sense we're looking at, you might say, the opinion of that political theorist that's seen as the first modern political scientist, so to speak, and his hero. And if we look at Ferdinand as a kind of a cynic, I'm not sure that he deserves that, but if we look at him as the cynic and as Isabella as a kind of zealot or perhaps fanatic, at least in this royal pair, then I think or harass or liquidate Jews or other seemingly perverse or harmful minorities. Along with these, I think we can see that we have the populace that at least as passively, if not actively, involved in this. Certainly Ferdinand and to some degree Isabella take their cue from the way many in the populace who themselves might be taking cues from the church, at least elements within the church, and elements from within even the aristocracy might see as the perpetrators. And if we look at Ferdinand and Isabella and we compare them with some more modern individuals, we can see Louis XIV, who was interested in unifying his France and with a single decree forcing Protestants to leave the country. In fact, this raison d'etat, this reason of state, was characterized by the idea, I'll say it in English, of one law, one faith, and one king. And that's in some ways what Ferdinand and Isabella, you can see some of the late Tsars in Russia, Alexander III, Nicholas II, who in a sense gave a green light to pogroms from down below. Certainly Adolf Hitler is our most obvious example here. He had far less time to do it than did Louis XIV and the Russian Tsars and Ferdinand and Isabella. And we might say even here there's a certain amount of time build up in that liquidation. One people, one Reich, one empire, and one leader, one Führer. And I think this idea of unity is something that even back to the Visigoths, we can see this idea that somehow evident elements that aren't unifying and joining the bandwagon need to be disposed of one way or another. And that this was fairly popular up and down Spanish society. We see no protests. If we turn to the mechanics of the expulsion and the forced, we see large numbers of conversos. Then we have to address the influence out there. You might say the root of the problem, as it was perceived, the practicing Jews themselves. So once we begin to see large numbers of conversos and many of them becoming increasingly suspect, then it's almost a foregone conclusion that the Jews would be up for some kind of treatment one way or another. We mentioned the problem of timing, a kind of limbo element into the stratified society of Spain at the time, but more particularly the timing of the last crusade, if I may use that term, against Granada, in that Ferdinand and Isabella draw upon the wealth of non-converted Jews, some of which had high rank, protected Jews by the court itself, and cynically Ferdinand uses much of this wealth to finance his campaign against Granada, and then once Granada is the conquest of Granada, and then the expulsion of the Jews themselves, and then after that, you might say the subtle attack on the Moorish population, which did not represent nearly as high-ranking and as wealthy and as supposedly subversive a population, because they weren't the tax collectors, the high administrators, even the physicians, not to mention the financiers of the crown itself. So the point here is that the mechanics also went way beyond 1492. The Inquisition stuck around. We might say that Ferdinand and Isabella's persecution was at the beginning of modern Spain and not toward the end of a decadent, dying empire, such as you might say France would become after Louis XIV, or Russia would become after the pogroms of the last few Tsars and collapse in 1917, or the Third Reich would expend itself in part in the mass liquidation of Jews and other enemies of the folk. This was in modern Spain. As Tony mentioned, the Inquisition keeps on going. It spread out into the larger empire for the greater glory of God and the Spanish kings and monarchs and so forth, and the dispensable quality of the Jews, who now, of course, have left much of their property behind for the state to capitalize on, but their skills, their abilities, and so forth can be, in a sense, substituted by the wealth of the new empire, the gold and silver of New Spain, and to some degree the importation of foreign and the outside to come into Spain. On racism, by the way, I just want to say one thing, that even though racism is not overtly a factor, the idea of tracing pedigree, maybe not as seen as ethnic Jews as such, but the idea of pedigree as important, and that Jews, even like Torquemada, were known, and conversos were known by up into the third or fourth generation by who their ancestors were. And for a place like Spain, this was highly important. So in a sense, we don't have specifically an ethnic anti-Semitism, but lines and knowing who your grandparents or great-grandparents were. So it's a kind of an ersatz or substitute racism that I think we can see in tracking down the conversos and knowing that they were new Christians and making sure that they are new Christians and not old Christians in this respect. Side by side with racism, such as it was or wasn't, I think we have to keep class struggle in mind, that many of those that were behind the persecutions from down below were looking at the wealth, the debts that they could appropriate, and saw the Jews as an upper class that they could benefit from one way or another. Was it worth it for Spain in terms of the consequences? Well, in the short run, possibly so, even with a golden age. But in the longer run, certainly the know-how, the loyalties, such as they may have been, the absence of a important middle and, you might say, upper class financially, economically, commerce-wise, and Spain had the same kind of disastrous effects. They were the pioneers of unity, and in some ways this idea of dealing with the Jewish question, such as it may or may not have been, was first addressed really forcefully by Ferdinand and Isabella, and the purges of Jews that we'd seen in England or France earlier, and the unification trends that had begun earlier, with or without Charlemagne, were several centuries ahead of time compared to Spain. And so Spain was making up, or you might say the monarchs were making up for lost time. The question, you might say, a medieval garden or a golden age of Jews in Spain, I think has to be raised, because if they had it relatively quite good in Spain, did they have it as well, as good in other parts of the Arab Empire, in Baghdad or elsewhere? Was Spain really that much better for Jews than other parts of tolerant Islam? And would the Ottoman Empire, whether it's North Africa, Greece, Palestine, Israel, if you will, Turkey itself, did this offer the same kind of golden age that the Middle Ages did in Spain? One possible answer to that is the Turks in general were not as intellectually curious as the Arabs were. They didn't, how shall we say, respond to the legacy of the Greco-Roman civilization at the degree that the Arabs did, and some of this, of course, was left over in Spain. But at this point, I think I'm kind of running out. I want to let Alper take over, but I just want to say one other point of comparison, or at least mention and bring it up. You saw in the film the survivals, the architectural survivals, the legacies, the square dedicated to Maimonides, named after him today. This is the kind of, you might say, not just nostalgia, but legacy that still lives visually in Spain. Do we find this kind of legacy in Germany, or even in Russia, under Tsars, commissars, or capitalists? No. The fact is that the Spaniards, for whatever 500 years, have kept this legacy, at least skeletally, there, and I'm looking forward to Alper's little story about somebody that returns back to Spain. And with that suspense, let me just leave you hanging until the end of Alper's story. Alper is a music major from Istanbul, Turkey. He's a Sephardic Jew, and I'd like to pass the baton to Alper. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. We'd like to give you some information how Jews live in Turkey and what they've been through those 500 years. And I also want to talk about the celebrations that's happening now in Turkey. When they left in 1492 Spain, they came to Ottoman Empire, to Constantinople, which is Istanbul now. And the Sultan accepted them, and the Sultan gave them their rights to go on with their religion, what they believe, what they do. Another reason, because they were merchants, so they could help also the economical situations to Ottoman Empire. And they also had to pay a minority tax like others, like Armenians or Christians living in the Ottoman Empire. And those years, they really involved in, we really involved in Turkish government and everything else. And first of all, like for example, in 1727, the first printing press was brought Turkey to Ottoman Empire by Ibrahim Müteferrika, that's the guy's name. And he was also a helper of Jewish people, so it was kind of Jews brought it to Turkey. So they were really involved in social activities also. And when they came, they spoke Ladino. That was their language, Spanish. But after years, because they were teaching their children were teaching their children, and after years, and because of Turkish words, they came into like Los Pacheros. They're singing songs, and they're bringing those authentic songs back again. And all those years, they always kept their traditions, only like with one extra day in Passover, because Jews live in the diaspora, which means lands outside Israel. So like in Passover, and when Jews in Israel have one, like the first day, they come together and then they eat. Jews in diaspora in Turkey or in Izmir, there are maybe like 1,000 people, but they still stick together they have their own club, and they come together as much as they can. In Edirne, there are like only 5 families left. And in Istanbul, there are like 5-6 synagogues, which are all very old, and they're Orthodox. They're actually, comparing to American Jews, more Orthodox, because some ideas like they speak, and I go to Turkish schools. There's only one Jewish school in Istanbul, and so people mostly go to Turkish Muslim schools. And when there's for example, when there's a religion lesson, which is in Muslim, for Muslims, is the prayers, learning prayers in Arabic and everything else. We're not attending those classes. We just sit down and just listen to it. And only there's a little difference. Like I mentioned, the Jews or Armenians or Christians, minorities, cannot be in government. They can be the president of Turkey, or they can be generals. They can go to army. They can be soldiers because they have to do it as a citizenship duty. But they can't be generals of upper places. And in the 20th century, a lot of Jews left Turkey to go to Israel. Some, I think, not many went to Turkey. To kill Turkish Jews, and the list was with last names and first names. I don't know the amount. Probably over 50,000 people. And now because of the 500 year, they're having celebrations. They're having a lot of panels, exhibitions, there are concerts, like some very authentic Turkish Jew, classical Turkish music composers. They have their concerts, and some people come to, like I know one guy, and he came to America, and he is visiting all the big schools like Yale, Harvard, Stanford, and giving conference or panels about Jews in Turkey. That's also very good for Turkey, because Turkey is not a country well known around the world. So that way, people learn more about Turkey. And also, I would like to show. This is the article that you have in your hands. At the back, it says. It says Jewish culture and Ladino are not surviving very well. It's to the end. For Ladino, it's true. Ladino is not really surviving very well. That's true. As though there are many things happening for bringing Ladino back. But for Jewish culture, it's wrong. I don't agree with that. It's mostly the opposite. I can even say, and that when I heard that, I was really amazed. So, thank you very much.
I just wanted to clarify something that you mentioned about the language that I would disagree with, and that is that Ladino is like Yiddish is to German. That is not true. Ladino is the Spanish, it is the pure Spanish that was spoken.
Present-day Portuguese, is that true? Because of the softening of certain consonants and sibilants.
The je.
The je, right.
Yeah. Well, as I said, in Salonika, for instance, they don't say iju, they say fiju, that f sound, which was from Castile at that time. But it is the Spanish that was spoken at that time, and if you listen to the music, that's the song that you heard, which is supposedly a song that came from Spain. That is the old Spanish. I just wanted to clarify that. What I wanted to say was that Sephardim do not make a distinction between orthodoxy, conservative, or reform. We are only Orthodox. There is no distinction. Now, there has been a change over the years, whereas that's true. When I grew up, we sat upstairs. It's very much of a patriarchal society. But today, men and women do sit together. Women do go to the bima. That has changed, and it has changed in the sense that all of our services are conducted, or were conducted, in Hebrew and Ladino. No English. That, of course, has changed because there has been intermarriage, people coming in who do not speak Ladino, and so because of that, they have accommodated people by speaking English.
We have time for just a few questions, so why don't we
May I make just a brief announcement? If there are any political or otherwise sensitive questions, the three of us on the left will attempt to address them.
Well, I have a kind of curiosity. I'd like to maybe address it to you about you gave a couple of profiles on the Inquisition, and I'm wondering if anyone has done a study of Torquemada. It seems like an interesting case. Was he proving his loyalty as a converso? What was he doing?
This is a thesis, so to speak, that a Spanish historian, Americo Castro, and I guess English-speaking historian, John Eliot, have come up with since the 1950s or 60s, in that Torquemada was just one of several conversos that were gung-ho new Christians trying to prove themselves so that they wouldn't be under any fire.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how other historians view this, but knowing human nature, it could have been. But your question about historical studies probably should be deflected to Professor White.
Tony, I didn't mean to.
One more question.
Well, yeah, I comment on that. I mean, it is Eliot, and I think the Americo Castro, by the way, whose book, The Structure of Spanish, is very excellent and very good in terms of basically explaining the uniqueness of Spain, etc., in terms of both the Arabic and Hebrew or Jewish influence in Spain, contributing significantly to the language. And Ladino, by the way, is that word has another meaning. In Latin America or Guatemala or southern Mexico, it means mestizo or Indian in Spanish or European. And also Castilian, earlier on probably was more like Gallego, which today is more like Portuguese. Gallego is a language spoken in northern Spain. And
probably, if there's any kind of a parallel in German or East European society, it would be that these Aryans, so to speak, had become communist and hence were suspect, although there was no question there was no inquisition. And generally speaking, there was no interrogation in terms of, well, how Jewish are you, or how, among the Nazis, it was, they had the records on them. So in that sense, there wasn't this kind of inquisition. It was an outright, are the papers there in terms of proving Jewish background? Questions asked other than that, unless a bribe or something, who knows, might get it to the right place. I would say too that once the Nazis got going outside of Germany, they didn't waste any time at all, whereas the Inquisition was an ongoing thing once it got started. Of course, the Spanish Empire lasts a lot longer, as Tony said, for 300 years you've got an Inquisition, whereas the Nazis, you didn't have to apply to anywhere outside for permission to establish a Gestapo or an SS. They didn't have exterior models or past models to draw from in terms of this kind of thing. It was a totally new experience. And there was, in this sense, it came from the brain of Adolf Hitler and Mein Kampf. And Ferdinand or Louis or any of these other people never had a kind of blueprint for how they were going to deal with their Jews early on, even before they came to power. So in that sense, Hitler was far more, not just Machiavellian, but was more systematic in terms of following through on his earlier thoughts, where for Ferdinand it was a kind of just a logical thing when he